So I figure most of the people in this room know you guys, but I would just, if you could just introduce yourselves, say hi, and tell me who your favorite person in the history of computer science is.
Okay.
And why.
So I'm Joe Beda, and my favorite person in computer science, I would say Ada Lovelace, because she was the first programmer and was a badass and was super cool.
I'm Brendan. I would go with, I don't know that I have a single favorite, but I'm going to go with Steve Wozniak, one of the co-founders of Apple, and like the unknown beetle of Apple, I guess. So,
Hey, I'm Craig. I'll go with Jack Travell, the guy who created the Commodore 64. I would have had the loneliest, most depressing teenage years, but for the Commodore 64, so thank you, Jack.
So, one of the reasons, you guys are here and the festivities of the week are all around Kubernetes, this project that has been following you around for a few years now. Looking back on the progress you've made so far and where we are today with Kubernetes, I guess let's just start there. Where are we today? How has the project evolved? What's left to be done? And what are you most proud of, I guess, in over the course of that 5-year period? And just jump in.
I don't know. I mean, I felt like we hit this inflection point when we started talking about things like RBAC and policy. I was like, oh, I guess we're enterprise now. It was not in the initial roadmap. But I think that's, there's a degree of ubiquity that comes along with that. I think for me, the thing I'm most proud of is really the community. I feel like we've gotten incredibly lucky, both in how the community has expanded and supported the project, and in some ways, the lack of drama that's there has been really fantastic. So, I don't know.
And a quick shout out to Slack. Kubernetes, we have a Slack that's open to the public that is provided free by Slack, the company. So
Very
thank
nice.
you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things we talked about probably I think a year or two ago was talking about making Kubernetes boring. Getting to the point where it was reliable enough that it kind of disappeared into the woodwork and folks didn't think about it because they were just working and solving their problems. I think we've made good progress there. I feel like we're hitting this sort of middle age where it is boring and it's changing sort of the tenor of the project in a good way because folks are really depending on it.
I mean, for me, I think, it's interesting to see the evolution of Kubernetes. As it started as a, almost a love letter to distributed systems engineers in the early days, indicating what could be, embracing the idea of open design, open community, open development, and as it built into something that's very real, it's been just humbling and amazing to watch. Where it is right now, it's real, it's fantastic. I spend a lot of time with a lot of enterprise organizations that are betting the farm on Kubernetes. They're looking to go beyond Kubernetes as a sort of primary platform for next generation stateless workload management. And they're starting to really think about, how do I create this platform that enables me to bring everything together, achieve that true sort of Goldilocks abstraction. Low enough level you can run pretty much anything, high enough level that it hides away a lot of the vagaries of the infrastructure. When I look to the future, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to sort of complete the offering in terms of hardening and getting the security there, working through a lot of the edge cases as we bring additional workloads into the platform. In terms of what am I most proud of, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is seeing organizations really make it theirs. There's a lot of folks that are had every reason to look at Kubernetes as a competitive undertaking. To look at Kubernetes that was threatening to an existing business or threatening to a set of technologies that they'd built. And by and large, pretty much everyone, every significant vendor at scale, every cloud provider, every organization has on the sort of provider side a Kubernetes strategy now. And it's just been amazing to watch a lot of really big companies that ought to ostensibly be competing and trying to find ways to fit it to their environment in a unique way, really collaborating through this open and engaged community, and mutually advancing the needs and capabilities of all the end users. So it's just been wonderful to watch.
With the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done differently?
I don't know. There were lots of mistakes.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's like we sort of corrected them along the way.
Well, I mean, one of the things that at VMware, we're putting a lot of effort into the community is around how do you deploy and manage Kubernetes over time, right? And I think a lot of folks will use a managed service provided by the cloud providers, but I think one of the benefits of Kubernetes is it's so flexible and go into so many different places. And we didn't do a good job early on in terms of providing great tooling, great opinions, great guides in terms of the right way to run the system over time. And I think we're working on that now, but I think it took us too long to get there.
Yeah, I think the other thing, there are two other things now that I think about it. One is we didn't build good integration tests, and I think that haunts us to this day. Like we have unit tests, and we have really heavy end-to-end tests. But if you want to do tests sort of in that middle zone, really there's not great infrastructure in the project, and it's one of those things that's really hard to retrofit. We also did governance way too late.
Yeah.
I think in retrospect, and we got lucky, and it didn't really hurt us.
We were able to slip the clutch.
We managed to make it go, but like...
You mean in terms of a competing version emerging, or?
No, I mean like project governance. Like when we brought the Bootstrap committee together to set up the rules of how we were going to organize the project, we were too big. We did it reactively in response to seeing that we were growing too big. We should have proactively, I mean, it's hard to know.
But, I mean, so a little bit of history. So when we started the project, a bunch of sort of relatively senior engineers with a mostly aligned vision were just rolling up their sleeves and writing code. And that worked for quite a while. But as the project got more complicated, as we moved past sort of like the stuff that was obvious early on, as it became clear that it was going to be big business, you started ending up with conflict in the community. Should we go this direction or that direction? We now have a governance structure in place with a steering committee and all that type of stuff going on. But we waited too long to do that.
Yeah.
That's what.
And I mean, I think the thing for me was, the really telling thing for me was this moment when we did the first sort of community survey. And there was tremendous enthusiasm about the project, what it could do for people and all this sort of stuff. And there was tremendous confusion about how to get involved and where the project was going. And it was like, people are really excited about this, but they have no idea how to help, and they have no idea where, like how decisions are made. And that indicated that like we had a governance problem. And so that was sort of one of the things that led to the development of the governance stuff.
From my side, I would say, it's very hard to figure out how to do this differently, but one of my biggest regrets as I look back on the history of Kubernetes is that we weren't more efficient in aligning the world of Kubernetes and the world of Docker, right? So if you actually think about what Docker brought to the party in the early days was it was legitimately ground changing, like the ability to package up and atomically seal a workload, a really elegant and nicely put together tool chain. And I felt like, we were collectively hurt. The two communities were hurt because we were not able to really bring it together. And I think Kubernetes could have benefited tremendously from a lot of the design ethos and the kind of developer tooling experiences that Docker and the Docker community had brought together. And I think, the Kubernetes community could have brought a lot of, richness in terms of distributed systems capabilities to the Docker. And so, I don't know exactly how we would have, done this differently, but if we could have had our druthers, I think bringing those two worlds together in a much more harmonized fashion earlier would have benefited everyone significantly.
Well, it's interesting because there was nominal competition really between what Docker was trying to do with Swarm and what Kubernetes was trying to do, and I don't know if you see it exactly that way because it was an open source project versus what Docker was trying to do as a commercial company, but it's just an interesting tangent. What would that have looked like? Do you think?
Well, I don't think concretely, I don't think there had to be competition in the orchestration space, right? I think there was, we tried to and I think this was the thing they did right. We really tried to draw a line and say above this line, we're going to have an ecosystem and we're going to have places where you can create your own tooling and your own experiences. And you see the benefits of that today. I think that, we could have probably gone forward as a joint community in that spirit. It didn't happen, but I think I'm with Craig. Like I think and not only did it could we have influenced each other in really positive ways, but I think it also sort of hindered adoption for a while because there was uncertainty and you'd see vendors being like, well, how do I target my monitoring? Do I target my monitoring at Kubernetes? Do I target my monitoring somewhere else? Like consolidation was what helps the ecosystem move forward.
So I want to definitely talk about things that are upcoming and things that you guys are thinking about as well, but I do want to take one more look back, and I want to see your answers to who wrote the sloppiest code in the early days of Kubernetes.
That's me.
Well, no, okay, so
It depends on how you count.
yeah, because
You wrote a lot of bash.
yeah, so Brendan is really good at just splatting some stuff out there to actually sort of prove a point and get something up and running. I think that's his sort of superpower. But early on, I did a lot of work that was kind of janitorial work, and like that included some of the early stuff about how do we actually launch a cluster, at that point on GCE, and it was, those are the sins that we're paying for now in terms of like the lifecycle tools, and like that original stuff was, it was
That stuff
not
lived
pretty.
far longer than
I can't believe
than
it's
anyone
still- it's
thought
actually
that
still
anyone
around.
thought it would. Although I do remember at one point Craig saying something. I'm going to paraphrase him here, but Craig said something to me like, "You have really great ideas and you're really innovative, and you leave this trail of filth behind you like you would never believe." I don't know if you remember. But
That sounds like Craig. The word filth is like, yeah, definitely.
And we all have our different strengths, I guess. Yeah.
So what would you consider the biggest unsolved problem in distributed computing right now? If we accept that Kubernetes is more or less of a solution, it's moving towards maturity, it's hardening, it's getting all these things that you guys are talking about. So forget about that. Just look at the broader world of distributed computing. What's the biggest unsolved problem?
Different definitions of distributed computing. I think it's everything from like consensus algorithms and like how do you do database replication across regions with like, vector clocks and that stuff. I think we're moving to a world where it's like that's hard, you make that somebody else's problem, and we're getting to the point where the patterns and the algorithms are packaged up. If we expand that to include things like cloud APIs and stuff like that, I think one of the hard problems is generally configuration. Right, and this is everything from Puppet Chef, Terraform, in the Kubernetes world, like Helm, Customize. There's like a gazillion projects. And none of them get it 100% right. And so I think whereas we have a real sort of good library of ideas of how we build abstractions at sort of the programming language level, we don't have a good agreed upon tool set and set of abstractions for how you actually sort of build higher level concepts when it comes to cloud configuration and API systems.
Oh, that's an infinite. We could spend an infinite amount of time on that topic. I think from my perspective, it's too hard. Like it's for people who know how to build the systems, it takes too long. And there's not enough reuse. And also the sort of total addressable space of developers who can successfully build cloud-based applications is far smaller than it should be. Like if you consider the number of developers who work on like front ends versus the number of people who work in the cloud, that should be the same number of people, I think, or even more people working on the cloud, and it's not. And I think that's a failure of us in terms of we build the systems up to a point, and then we don't really build systems that are easy for developers to use. I don't think Kubernetes is easy for developers to use.
That's what I also hear.
Yeah, and so I think that's an area that we have to do better on. And unfortunately, it's not an area where people who like to build things like Kubernetes also like to spend time.
It's in our industry, there is sort of user experience as a well-recognized discipline. People get degrees in it. It's whole departments. You have sort of, heads of UX. We need a similar type of movement around developer experience in the infrastructure space. And I think, DX or developer experience is not as well recognized as a discipline.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Joe and I actually didn't speak about this beforehand, but I'd had that in my mind that I was going to answer the question.
Sorry.
Configuration. Looking beyond the configuration space, there's one thing that is certainly on my mind at the moment, which is establishing and Joe's actually done some work on this, but the idea of service identity as a first-class entity and being able to deal with identity in a highly connected federated world, not just in terms of the user principles, but being able to establish service identity as a first-class entity is an incredibly important area of that we need to invest in as an industry. And I don't think we've yet got to a point where that sort of critical mass around how to establish service identity as a first-class entity is there. Like if you look inside places like Google, they have great systems to deal with it. A lot of the big internet companies have figured this out, but it just hasn't been made accessible to enterprises holistically. And I think that's going to be an area that we'd want to see happen in the next 5 years.
I would say security in general, though, is there's a huge gap. It's seen as this other thing, somebody else's problem, something that's either sort of like layered on after the fact. We don't make security accessible to developers and sort of an ambient thing.
Yeah.
So discounting the companies you currently work for, who do you think is doing some of the most interesting things on top of Kubernetes right now? We've had several companies and representatives of companies here today, startups who are working on things using the Kubernetes API layer. Some interesting, ways to, I think, tackle some of those problems, developer experience and some of the other, usability issues. So who's catching your eye? Like when you look out at people who are tapping into the power of Kubernetes, what comes up?
I mean, I like to think more about sort of the projects that are spinning up on top, rather than, and I think that's actually the right way to think about it in general. Like, this has become such a ubiquitous layer, such a uniform layer that if you're going to build something interesting on top of Kubernetes, it has to go everywhere, right? And so generally the way to do that is to build an open source project and then figure out how you integrate it back into the product. So, I've actually been spending a lot of time thinking about policy. I mean, I mentioned policy at the start, but thinking about policy and the open policy agent work that's in the CNCF. There's some really interesting things there as people realize that, you can guard the exterior of your cluster, but actually you need to also be making rules about the kinds of objects that get placed into your cluster. Like, what image repository are you using, or what tags are you putting on objects? That stuff turns out to be incredibly important for some of the security stuff that people are talking about.
That's actually a good segue into one of the other things I wanted to talk about, which is open source right now and some of the
it's a hot button topic.
interesting developments that are happening. And we just over the last 6 months, we've seen several, mostly database companies, change the terms of their licenses in order to be more restrictive. And usually with the threat of looming, catastrophe placed on them by a cloud provider. If you were starting a project like Kubernetes again today, would you still make it fully open source? Would you think about that differently?
No.
And why
I don't think so. I mean,
You
Kubernetes.
wouldn't make it open source?
No. I would totally make it open source. It was phrased as,
Yeah.
what would you change, right? Anyway, It doesn't matter. I would make it very open source. I think it was clear that for infrastructure, if it's going to be ubiquitous, it has to be open. Databases may be different. I don't know. I haven't built a database. But for something that is in the stack where Kubernetes is, where you're going to have, you need to have a whole bunch of different companies taking very significant bets on it. It has to be fully open. It has to be vendor neutral. I mean, I think actually getting it to foundation is critical for its success. So beyond open source, it actually has to be in a foundation.
I think in terms of forming a company around open source, I think that we're seeing an evolution in terms of what those business models are. I think the critical thing is to solve a business problem. It's not about the technology, it's about the problem that you solve. And sometimes that problem is, if you're a cloud provider, like, how do you actually sort of provide operations as a service? But I think that there's other business problems that, as you start looking beyond just the sort of developer persona, how does that technology actually impact the rest of the organization that goes beyond developers, that goes into operations folks, that goes into decision makers? Like, I think, that goes beyond just open source. And I think that's, as you construct your business model, I think that's what you have to think of. I think one of the problems, though, is that so many companies, and I think this is part of the sort of startup froth, is that they start with interesting technology and they'll figure out the business model later, right? And I think you get this confirmation bias looking at companies like Google, where you're like, well, it worked out for them, right? It doesn't always work out. And I think that, making sure that you do have a plan in terms of, like, how is open source part of your strategy as a company versus, we'll just put some stuff out there and see what happens.
Well, I think also the challenge for a lot of these is they start, and as you said, they start with technology.
Yeah.
They don't start with a business problem, right? And so therefore they're in search of a way to monetize. And I think you see this also a lot in the startup ecosystem, which is people just take too much money, right? And then they are suddenly like, oh my God, like, I have to get revenue and that puts a lot of pressure on people too. And so I don't know. I hope that this doesn't turn into a big judgment on open source, because I don't think that's the right way to think about it. But it's also worth saying, like, Kubernetes was intended to be an open source project. There wasn't a business there. It wasn't intended to be a business unto itself.
Well, that's one thing I've heard a lot of people worry about, though, too, is if the open source enterprise development is basically funded by big vendors, that there's potentially, innovative projects could not really find a home, could not really find a way to get noticed out in the world and to, have to support the development time and effort needed to get a project up and running.
But I feel like, oh, sorry, go.
So from my side, I mean, this is a perennial problem, right? And like what Joe said, if you're going to start a company, you better have a plan, right? And the plan can't be open source, and then commercialize later. You have to have a line of sight on a business problem. The way I've looked at it is there's sort of, there's a set of classic commercial models around open source, right? The first is the distro play. And that almost always ends in disaster, right? So there's the idea of like, I'm going to create a distribution. I'm either going to go completely open source, and eventually I'm going to have a competitor that will, show up over time if I'm successful, and they'll just ghost after my business. They will pick up my renewals because there's nothing defensive there. Their cost of sales is lower than mine because their customers have already deployed the technology, and they just pick up the support subscription on the back end, which leads to the kind of open core philosophy or some esoteric licensing things where you try to create artificial walled gardens. And that inevitably will get you on the wrong side of your own community, and bad things happen, right? The second way to monetize open source is to be Red Hat. I don't mean be like Red Hat, I mean literally be Red Hat. They created a very nuanced model, and they achieved that point of singularity in the community where they're able to be the sort of proxy between the OEMs and ODMs and the ISVs, and they established that point. And they had a very nuanced way of approaching open source commercialization. And I think every distro provider wants to become that, but I think there will only ever be one Red Hat. The third way to monetize open source is kind of obvious, which is monetize a secondary effect. And the organizations that are most efficient at monetizing the secondary effect are cloud providers. The secondary effect is infrastructure consumption. So anyone that is sort of able to monetize a secondary effect has a vested interest in consuming open source. I actually think there is a fourth model, and I don't think this has been kind of fully proven yet. But my sense is that there's a set of things that open source is really good at. It's, in terms of gaining adoption, gaining traction, gaining ubiquity, there's nothing bad about open source. And I think we will end up in a world where the code that sits between a company's applications and the physical infrastructure will ultimately be all open source. I think that will happen. But there's a lot of stuff that open source doesn't know. Like open source doesn't know about itself. It doesn't know if it's properly patched. It doesn't know necessarily how to manage and update itself. It doesn't know, how to optimize itself. So I think there's an opportunity to create an intersection between open source and SaaS-like data services that enable folks to be far more efficient in how they provision, deploy, manage, operate, consume open source technologies. And I think there is a significant business in that sort of fusion between SaaS to do the things that open source can't do to enable the consumption of open source and open source itself that hasn't been fully explored and materialized in the industry yet.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I mean, I think one of the challenges you're seeing right now is that the people who are really good at operationalizing software are the clouds, because that's basically what they do, is operationalize software. And it is too hard for other people to operationalize software. So they've driven up the expectations, right? Like your user expectation of how you consume software is now, I pay a monthly fee or an hourly fee and I get SLAs and all this kind of stuff. That's your expectation of software. It's not, hey, I installed something and I read the manual and I figure out how to run it. And it turns out that it's very difficult if you're a small company to deliver that. And I think that we will see the clouds and others make that easier. And I hope that in turn produces a software economy that works. I think there's very clear evidence that if you do a good enough job of producing a service, you can compete with the clouds. Snowflake is a great example of that, right? Everybody has a data warehouse, and yet Snowflake continues to sell on Azure and to sell everywhere else. And there's plenty of other similar examples.
But Snowflake was not an open source.
But I don't think this is the problem that I have, which is I don't think that the licensing model matters.
Okay.
Right? I mean, maybe Snowflake needs to be closed source. I don't know. I have no idea. But I don't actually think. I think it has to do with the operationalization of the software and the challenges of operationalizing the software more than the licensing model.
I think there's an interesting sort of recursive property here. I think Kubernetes makes it easier to actually run systems at scale, distributed systems at scale. So it's actually lowering the cost and complexity around creating operationalized software. And so as Kubernetes becomes a toolkit for operationalizing software, we may find that we're able to decouple sort of managed software from the underlying cloud in a way, like Snowflake. And I think that that's going to be an interesting opportunity. I think Kubernetes actually creates a lot of opportunity there.
The other thing I would observe is, there's this very interesting fragmentary force that we're starting to see in the industry right now. Like, it would be reasonable if you look at the ascendancy of cloud to assume that we would be in a period of massive consolidation, that everything would be getting simpler, everything would become consolidated. But the reality is when you look at the world of modern enterprise, it's actually going kind of the other way. Every enterprise that I work with has multi-cloud procurement policies. They're being forced by their procurement groups to buy across multiple clouds. In some cases, the regulators are saying, what happens if a hostile actor gets into the cloud's control plane? Like, what are you going to do then? In some situations, there's a sort of longer-term trend, which is, the utility of cloud as it stands today is really around, I can put down a lot of infrastructure next to cheap electricity, and I can achieve massive economies of scale. But we're also starting to see the distribution of the electricity supply. We're starting to see the emergence of things like, GDPR in Europe. We're starting to see local data privacy laws that are creating further fragmentation. There's nothing stopping the cloud providers from thriving and flourishing in this world and actually being able to address a lot of these intrinsically distributed problems. But we are seeing a period of massive fragmentation across the computational fleet, at a period where I think everyone was expecting more consolidation. And sort of speaking to the need to operationalize, I think there's an impetus to be able to operationalize not just in a specific environment, but across this highly fragmented, highly distributed fleet. And I think that's where the sort of next 10 years of massive enterprise outcomes for enterprise software vendors is going to be fought. It's not just in the massive cloud data center, but it's in this incredibly distributed, highly fragmented computational fleet.
So say you all get the startup bug and you want to start a company around an open source project. What's your business model?
Oh, this is easy. Services. And it's funny because the VCs will be like, you're just going to be Mirantis, right? And it's like, no, sorry, there's nothing wrong with Mirantis. They did a wonderful job with OpenStack, and you have to kind of appreciate and respect the work they did. There's a lot of folks that say you cannot commercialize open source on the back of services, and they're entirely right. You cannot scale a services business, but you have to start there, because nothing will teach you more about the challenges, the complexities, the necessities that enterprise organizations have for consuming open source technology than services. So start with services, and you will learn so much. You go and spend 6 months, in an enterprise data center deploying your technology with a big customer that's breathing down your neck. You will learn a few things. And that will then give you a platform that will enable you to start to identify, like, where are the key operating gaps? Where are the key challenges? What's really hard about this technology? And follow the customer needs. You'll learn so much through that process that will really lead you to identify where those kind of key areas that you can invest in to solve hard problems are.
I would sort of answer the same question. I would answer the same way in a slightly different venue, which is I'd start with SaaS. Like, maybe it's open source, but believe and know that you're eventually going to have to become a SaaS company, and so start there, right? And open source, as Craig said, is great for market penetration and adoption and enthusiasm, but ultimately people don't want to operate software. They want you to operate software for you. Realize that that's going to be your business and go in head first there, and you'll stand a chance. So,
I think you end up with SaaS, but I think that, I spent like 10 years at Google. Not all developers are the same. That experience at Google in no way prepares me to understand what the day-to-day life for sort of a enterprise Java developer in a Midwest bank is like.
Yeah.
Do you think that's to account for a lot of Google's struggles in this market?
I think Google's a unique place. I mean, they hire a unique type of individual. I think, they're learning, hard lessons in terms of what it takes to deliver to real enterprises.
So with the few remaining minutes we have here, I just wanted to check in on one thing. Kubernetes is a long name. It's frequently mispronounced and misspelled.
Copernicus.
And I read a report that you went through 13 different names before you settled on Kubernetes, before Google would approve.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
No, there's a lot.
So
I counted.
What was your favorite rejected name?
Oh, this is easy. Karina.
Oh, that was sad. I actually renamed the entire code base. I'd actually done it. Like applied
Which
the name.
it's a nebula.
It was a three-star thing, right? That was a star cluster, something like that. Anyway, I'd actually gone through and renamed the entire code base, and then we decided not to do that one.
Well,
And I
what
said,
happened is
whatever the next one is.
we did a Google search,
That's true.
and it came up with like a softcore porn star, and we're like, that's not a good
Vetoed
name.
that one.
I was really hoping for Project 7.
Yeah.
That was what I was really hoping for.
I think if I had to like, actually, the one I liked the best was Locutus.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Locutus. Yeah,
Oh,
Locutus
that would've been good.
Locutus was good.
So that was the Star Trek character. It was the Borg translator, right? But it was
Isn't it?
it was
actually,
tight enough.
The
To,
Locutus is is Picard when he turns into the Borg.
Is that
right?
it?
Isn't that right?
I'm Locutus.
yeah, I don't know.
I think that's right.
Oh, you're
They
out
will know.
geeking
They
me.
told me.
Yeah.
See.
But yeah, the ambassador for the Borg, that was a pretty good one.
I liked Project 7 because it was sort of like, well, what happened to the first 6? But,
Well, we're out of time. But thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, folks.